Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 22. Complexity as Derivation Depth. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We now stand high in the branches of Ep.8, the pure abstract language. We have walked from the simple alphabet of phi, through the grammar of derivatives, to the formation of topological words. We have explored the abstract meaning within the language itself, how symbols relate to one another, how time, space, and motion are three lenses on one structure, how intensity is measured, how action chooses elegant stories, how spectral modes form a pure basis, and how information is the act of narrowing down possibilities. In the last part, we saw that information is specificity, the way a particular pattern of phi rules out almost everything else it could have been. Today, we take the next logical step. If information tells us how specific a pattern is, we now ask, how demanding is that specificity? How deep into the language do we need to go to write such a pattern? How many layers of change must be involved for the story to exist? Today, we enter part 22, complexity as derivation depth. This part is about the cost of description in the language of phi. It is about what we really mean when we say that something is simple or complicated. Not in a poetic way, but inside the actual structure of the holophase language itself. Imagine you are describing a landscape to a friend over the phone. The first landscape is a vast, almost perfectly flat desert. The ground stretches out to the horizon in every direction. There are no cliffs, no valleys, no sudden drops. Just a slow, almost invisible curve of the earth itself. You can describe it in a few words. It is flat, completely flat. As far as the eye can see, it is flat. That is enough. You have already captured most of what matters about that scene. The description is short. It needs very few details. Its essence is the absence of change. Now imagine the second landscape, the Himalayan mountains. Suddenly, your words are not enough. You begin. There are immense peaks rising almost straight out of the earth, their tips covered in shining snow. Between them lie deep, shadowed valleys. Some slopes are gentle and covered with forests. Others are sheer cliffs of dark rock. A river cuts through the valley floor, winding and twisting, and small streams branch off like veins, feeding into it from the glacier above. Even after this, you feel that your description is missing something. You want to talk about how the path becomes steeper, how the curvature of the ridge changes, how the river bends more sharply in some places and relaxes in others. The more honestly you try to describe this mountain range, the longer your description becomes, and the more you are forced to talk about changes of changes of changes. The desert is simple. The Himalayas are complex. In our phi language, the description of a pattern is not a human paragraph, but a list of derivative conditions, the values of phi, its gradients, its curvatures, and all the higher orders that might matter. A flat desert could be described by saying that phi is constant, and its first spatial derivatives are zero everywhere. You do not even need to talk about higher derivatives, because there is nothing for them to describe. A mountainous region, in contrast, cannot be captured by phi alone or by its first derivative. To encode its intricate ridges, valleys, and twists, you need to say how the slope changes from place to place, and how the change of slope itself changes, and so on. You are forced higher and higher up the derivative tower. This is the core idea. In the Holophase language, complexity is derivation depth. It is how high in the hierarchy of how is this changing you must climb in order to faithfully encode the pattern. The deeper you must go into higher derivatives, the more structurally complex that pattern is. Another way to see this is through a different metaphor: the length of a recipe. Think of phi and its derivatives as the basic operations in a kitchen. You can heat, stir, fold, chop, and arrange. A simple pattern is like a simple recipe. Boil the pasta, add salt, serve. A complex pattern is like the recipe for a delicate dessert that rises only if you do everything just right. Separate the eggs, beat the whites until soft peaks form, gently fold the whites into the mixture without breaking the bubbles, maintain the oven at exactly this temperature. Do not open the door before this time. The longer and more conditional the recipe, the more complex the dish. In the same way, the longer and deeper the derivative recipe needed to generate a particular configuration of phi, the more complex that configuration is. This brings us naturally to a famous concept in computer science, Kolmogorov complexity. Kolmogorov asked a simple question: what is the shortest computer program that can produce a particular string of symbols? A string of 1 million zeros is highly regular, so the shortest program is very small. Print 0 1 million times. A completely random string of 1 million digits has no pattern you can compress, so the shortest program is almost as long as the string itself. Print 5294718 listing every digit. The random string is maximally complex in this sense. In the phi language, we can think in a similar way, but our program is expressed in the vocabulary of derivatives instead of computer instructions. The question becomes: what is the shortest description using phi and its derivatives that produces a given pattern? A pure sine wave in time, for example, has a very short description. Let phi oscillate with a constant frequency omega, constant amplitude, and set all higher time derivatives according to this simple rule. A pattern such as a heartbeat, which rises sharply, pauses, then falls slowly, requires more structure, constraints involving second and third time derivatives, and conditions that repeat in a controlled way. A fully turbulent fluid flow, with swirling vortices at many scales, would require an extremely long and deep derivative description. Its complexity is high, because you cannot capture it with just a few simple statements about phi and its first derivatives. Now connect this to our three echoes: time-like, space-like, and motion-like. In time, consider the difference between a single click and a rich symphony. A click is a short, sharp event. To describe it in phi language, you might say, at this moment, phi jumps briefly and then settles. A symphony is built from rhythms inside rhythms. Slow changes in tempo, faster oscillations around notes, subtle variations in loudness and timbre. To describe a symphony structure in terms of derivatives of phi, you need a tower of temporal derivatives that captures long-term phrasing, medium-term patterns, and rapid fluctuations all at once. The derivation depth is much greater. In space, compare a perfect soap bubble with a rugged coastline. A bubble is smooth and symmetric. Its curvature is the same everywhere. You can describe it with a simple condition on the second spatial derivative: constant curvature. A rugged coastline, by contrast, is jagged at many scales. Seen from far away, it has large bends and bays. Seen closer, it has smaller inlets and capes. Seen even closer, it has fine, rocky detail. To represent this structure faithfully, you need higher and higher spatial derivatives of phi, capturing the way the gradient and curvature change across scales. The derivation depth of this coastline pattern is very large. In motion, imagine a smooth rolling ball versus the chaotic trajectory of a leaf caught in a turbulent stream of air. The rolling ball has a nearly constant velocity, maybe with a gentle acceleration. A low derivative description suffices. The leaf, however, is constantly twisting, speeding up, slowing down, tumbling in unpredictable ways. To define its exact path as a pattern of phi, you need to specify not just velocity and acceleration, but many higher changes of those quantities through time. The motion pattern has high derivation depth. So we can say complexity is the depth of the how is this changing question chain needed to single out the pattern. Simple patterns answer that chain in just one or two steps. Complex patterns demand answers many steps up the tree. Where does this sit in the master tree? Think of complexity as the altitude of a leaf. The lower branches correspond to patterns that can be encoded with low derivative order. Phi itself, its first derivatives, maybe its second derivatives. The leaves on these branches are simple shapes, simple rhythms, simple flows. As you move upward, the branches become finer and more numerous. Leaves at higher levels represent patterns that depend on accurately specifying many higher derivatives together. Their very existence requires deep, coordinated structure in the derivative tower. A leaf high in the canopy is a symbol for a high complexity configuration. Height here is metaphorical, but it captures the intuition. More levels of derivative detail must be fixed. Complexity also has a direct relationship with information. In the last part, we said that information is about how many alternatives you have ruled out. Complexity now asks, how sophisticated did your language need to be, and how many derivative layers did you need to engage in order to rule them out? A simple crystal has a lot of information in the sense that it rules out most other atomic arrangements. But its rule is simple. Repeat this unit cell in three directions. It has low derivation depth. A random static pattern also rules out many other patterns, but has no short description. Its derivation depth is effectively enormous. A living cell sits somewhere in between, highly constrained, yet also highly organized and compressible in certain languages. Understanding its complexity in the phi language means understanding exactly how deep into the derivative structure we must go to fully capture its dynamics and organization. Complexity touches our earlier ideas about topology as well. A simple, unknotted loop drawn in space can be described with low topological and derivative complexity. A trefoil knot is more complex. Its shape cannot be undone without cutting, and representing that structure requires more detailed conditions on phi's spatial derivatives around the knot. More complicated knots, or linked knots, demand progressively more intricate derivative patterns to remain stable. Their complexity is not just that they are fancy shapes, but that their existence requires very particular high-level constraints in space. The action principle also interacts with complexity. The path of stationary action is often, though not always, the simplest possible story that respects the boundary conditions and the constraints of the system. In many physical settings, the chosen path has relatively low derivative depth compared to wildly more jagged or irregular alternatives that would require extra wiggles in time and space. It is as if the language of reality often prefers to tell its stories with just enough complexity to satisfy the constraints and no more. However, there are also systems where the action naturally produces complex behavior, such as chaotic solutions, where small changes in initial conditions can lead to high effective derivation depth later on. There, the simple action rules generate complex structure over time. Spectral modes give us yet another way to measure complexity. A pattern built from only one or two modes, a single frequency in time, or a single spatial harmonic is very simple. A pattern that needs hundreds or thousands of modes, each with carefully chosen amplitude and phase, is complex. Mapping this back to derivatives, a rich mix of modes corresponds to a pattern that has structure at many scales, and therefore requires higher derivative orders to describe. The more modes that are significantly active in the pattern, the deeper the derivative story must go. We can now state the role of complexity more clearly. It is a measure of how hard the pattern is to make and to describe in the native language of phi. A shallow pattern is easy to generate. A simple recipe, a few derivative rules, and it appears. A deep pattern is hard to generate. It requires many finely tuned derivative relations, all holding at once. The deeper the derivation depth, the more delicate and unlikely the pattern is within the full space of what phi could have done. That is why we often associate high complexity with the presence of a long history, a long chain of events, or the work of intentional design. Many conditions must have aligned for that pattern to exist. To make this even clearer, let us walk through several examples across different scales of reality and see how complexity as derivation depth helps us talk about them in one unified way. At the level of simple physics, imagine again a single pendulum. If you put it back a little and let it go, its motion traces out a smooth arc, back and forth, back and forth. The angle as a function of time is almost a pure sine wave. To describe this mathematically, you mostly need the first and second time derivatives of phi, how quickly the angle is changing, and how that rate of change itself responds to gravity. Beyond that, the higher derivatives are small corrections. The story is shallow. Now attach a second pendulum to the first and watch what happens. The double pendulum swings in a way that quickly becomes chaotic. Its path is still determined by clear physical laws, but the outcome is extremely sensitive to the tiniest differences in starting conditions. To write down its exact motion, you would need a very long and detailed description of how its derivatives behave over time. You have moved from a shallow story to a deep one, from low derivation depth to effective high depth. At the level of chemistry, you can compare a well-mixed gas to a complex reaction pattern. In a sealed container of gas at equilibrium, the density field is almost uniform. The gradients are small. The second and higher spatial derivatives are essentially zero. The gas is specific in the sense that its temperature and pressure have definite values, but its spatial pattern is simple. In a reaction diffusion system, by contrast, chemicals react and spread in such a way that waves and spirals can arise on their own. To describe these evolving patterns of concentration, you must track not only the value of phi, but also strong gradients, sharp fronts, and curved interfaces that move and split. This requires higher spatial and temporal derivatives. The reaction diffusion pattern has greater derivation depth and therefore greater complexity. At the level of biology, think of the difference between a simple heartbeat and the full rhythm of an animal's life. The basic heartbeat is already a pattern with some complexity. It has a clear waveform with a rapid spike, a plateau, and a relaxation. To describe it in phi language, you need constraints involving several time derivatives, not just a single oscillation. But when you add the circadian rhythm, the influence of hormones, the modulation from breathing, and the feedback of emotions, the combined pattern of heart activity becomes vastly richer. It now contains slow cycles, medium cycles, and fast cycles, all intertwined. To capture this, you need to climb higher into the derivative tower, because the system is now responding not just to immediate conditions, but to the history of its own changes. The complexity of the living heartbeat is thus a measure of its derivation depth in the temporal and regulatory structure of phi. With all these examples in mind, we can sharpen the difference between three often confused ideas: order, randomness, and structured complexity. A perfectly ordered pattern, like an infinite checkerboard, is very specific but easy to describe. Alternate black and white squares forever in both directions. That is low derivation depth, even though the pattern is exact and rigid. A perfectly random pattern, like an ideal white noise signal, is also very specific. It picks one out of an enormous space of possibilities. Yet it is hard to describe in a compressed way. You mostly have to list it. That is maximal derivation depth. Between these extremes lies structured complexity, the kind of rich patterns we see in life, language, art, and many natural phenomena. They are neither strictly regular nor purely random. They are generated by relatively compact rules, but those rules reach high into the derivative tower and weave together many scales. The Holophase framework is especially aimed at this middle zone, where reality seems to do its most interesting work. Because we want this idea to be scientific and not only poetic, we also attach a test to it. The test, in simple words, is whether phi and its derivatives can serve as a universal generator of such structured complexity. Whenever scientists say this system is incredibly complex, we should, in principle, be able to translate that claim into the statement, this pattern of phi requires high derivation depth to encode. If one day we find a system whose complexity simply cannot be captured this way, no matter how we choose phi or how we define its derivatives, then the holophase picture would have met a wall. It would mean that there is some other principle of complexity at work that cannot be reduced to the structure of a single cyclic field and its hierarchy of change. For now, though, everything we know about physics, chemistry, biology, and information suggests that most real world complexity does arise from relatively simple rules, repeated and combined over many layers. Fluid equations, reaction diffusion systems, genetic networks, neural dynamics, and even social systems all seem to obey some kind of local rule that is applied over and over, building up structure. In the language of phi, a local rule is a statement about derivatives at one level, and the buildup of structure is exactly the climb in derivation depth as those rules generate patterns over time. This is why it is natural to see complexity as a direct expression of how deeply the Holophase language has been allowed to speak. There is also a personal side to this. Your own life is a pattern of phi. At birth, your body and brain begin in a relatively simple state, full of potential, but not yet full of detailed structure. As you grow, every experience, every lesson, every relationship carves further structure into your nervous system and into your habits. You become a more complex pattern. If we could see the derivative tree of your being, we would see that more and more branches have become filled in. More dependencies, more memories, more subtle patterns of response. In this sense, aging and learning are journeys up the derivation depth of your personal phi configuration. You are a living example of complexity as depth, written from the inside. In practice, we test the Holophase idea piece by piece. A swinging pendulum is easy. Its motion is nearly sinusoidal, and we can express it with low derivative depth. A double pendulum, which behaves chaotically, has higher complexity. Tiny differences in the initial derivatives explode into very different trajectories. A reaction diffusion system, like the Belousov-Jabotinsky reaction in chemistry, creates spirals and waves that spontaneously organize. These patterns clearly involve gradients, curvatures, and time derivatives interacting in non-trivial ways. Encoding them as phi patterns uses multiple levels of derivatives, but remains finite and coherent. The same goes for many biological rhythms and spatial patterns that we observe in growing organisms. When we look at technology, we see human beings deliberately sculpting high-complexity phi patterns. A simple carrier wave in a radio signal is low complexity, one frequency, constant amplitude. Modern communication signals, however, are full of structure. They combine many frequencies, modulate amplitudes and phases, and pack bits of information into subtle shifts of pattern. From the phi perspective, this is deliberate construction of high derivation depth configurations in the electromagnetic field. Engineers are writing long, sophisticated recipes in the language of derivatives to create patterns that reliably carry data from one place to another without being destroyed by noise. In daily life, you can start to feel complexity as depth whenever you meet something that forces you to keep asking more detailed questions to describe it. Look at a snowflake on your glove. At first you say, it has 6 arms. Then you see branching on each arm, then branching on the branches, and so on. Each step adds another layer to the derivative story. Or listen to a piece of music that at first sounds simple, but then reveals hidden rhythms, harmonies, and variations as you pay attention. Each newly discovered layer of structure is another hint of deeper derivation depth in the underlying phi description. What begins as a simple melody becomes, in your perception, a complex landscape as your ear starts to notice more and more of what is actually there. Finally, we return as always to the one field. Phi is capable of expressing patterns of almost unimaginable richness. Complexity, understood as derivation depth, is our way of measuring how much of this expressive power is being used in any given configuration. A calm sea at dawn is phi speaking in a very simple sentence. A hurricane is phi speaking in a long, wild paragraph full of nested clauses and subtle references. A single note is simple. A symphony is deep. Yet both are spoken in the same language, by the same underlying field. In Episode 8, our goal has been to understand the pure abstract language of the Holophase before we attach it to concrete physics. With information as constraint and complexity as derivation depth, we now have two key tools to talk about how specific and how demanding any pattern of phi really is. Information tells us how many alternatives have been ruled out. Complexity tells us how high into the derivative structure phi had to reach in order to create that ruling out. In the next stage of our journey, we will ask how such complex patterns can be held, remembered, and reused. If a configuration of phi has high derivation depth, what does it take to keep it stable over time? How does the field avoid simply relaxing back to something simpler? This will lead us into the notion of memory as hysteresis and into deeper questions about how phi can store and process its own patterns. For now, as you look around your world, try to sense not only what patterns are present, but how deep their stories must be in the language of change. A simple pattern is like a whisper. A complex one is like a long woven tale. Both are echoes of the same phi, spoken at different depths of its infinite tree. Salam, and peace be upon you, truly.